This presentation will discuss common issues found during the Title I Part A random validations that were conducted during the 2022-2023 school year. Before we begin, we want to ensure that viewers understand that this presentation is intended to provide general information and guidance to local education agencies in Texas and reflects the Texas Education Agency's current understanding of the presentation topics and applicable federal guidance. The content of this presentation is subject to change as a result of further potential information and guidance that may be provided by federal agencies with regulatory oversight of this program. This presentation does not constitute legal advice, and LEAs are therefore advised to seek legal counsel regarding the information and guidance provided in this presentation before acting on such information and guidance. During this presentation, we will provide background information on the random validation process, including results from prior year validations. We will also discuss the results from the current year and provide an explanation of the Title I Part A requirements that were included in the validation. These requirements include the description of comprehensive needs assessment process, the required stakeholders for the school-wide program plan, the campus written parent and family engagement policy, and the LEA's supplement not supplant methodology or statement of exemption. Let's start with some background from prior year validations. During the 2020-2021 school year, while schools were in the middle of the pandemic, we scaled back our monitoring activities. We randomly selected 80 LEAs from around the state to participate in a compliance survey, and then asked 20 of those LEAs to submit documentation on 2 Title I Part A requirements. We found that 12 of those LEAs were in compliance with both requirements. The first of the 2 requirements selected for the validation was related to the school-wide program comprehensive needs assessment. 13 LEAs met this requirement, while 7 LEAs needed improvement. The second requirement was related to the campus written parent and family engagement policy, method of distribution, and language. 15 LEAs met this requirement, and 5 LEAs needed improvement. The LEAs that needed improvement were asked to resubmit their documentation in order to demonstrate their compliance the following year. Of the 7 LEAs that needed improvement on the school-wide program campus comprehensive needs assessment, 6 met the requirement on the resubmission, and 1 still needed improvement. Of the LEAs that needed improvement on the campus written PFE policy method of distribution and language, 4 met the requirement on resubmission, and 1 still needed improvement. For the random validation process in 2021-2022, we increased the number of Title I Part A requirements included in the validation, as well as the number of LEAs involved. 3 different Title I Part A requirements were reviewed, but the LEAs selected were only asked to provide documentation for 1 of the requirements. The requirements selected were campus-based requirements, so when we selected the LEA, we also specified the Title I Part A campus to be reviewed. Overall, 43 of the 57 LEAs and campuses met the requirement for which they were selected. Broken down by each requirement, the results were as follows. Of the 12 LEAs and campuses that were selected for the school-wide program campus comprehensive needs assessment, 10 met the requirement and 2 needed improvement. Of the 23 LEAs and campuses selected for the school-wide program plan stakeholders, 22 met the requirement and 1 needed improvement. Of the 22 LEAs and campuses selected for the campus-written PFE policy method of distribution and language, 11 met the requirement and 11 needed improvement. When asked to resubmit documentation the following year, of the 2 LEAs that needed improvement on the Schoolwide Program Campus Comprehensive Needs Assessment, 1 LEA met the requirement and 1 still needed improvement. The 1 LEA that needed improvement on the Schoolwide Program Plan stakeholders met the requirement on resubmission. Of the 11 LEAs that needed improvement on the campus-written PFE policy method of distribution and language, 8 LEAs met the requirement and 3 still needed improvement. That brings us to our most recent set of validations. For the 2022-2023 school year, we selected a total of 60 LEAs and campuses for the Title I Part A validation. We continued to look at the same 3 Title I Part A requirements, with each LEA selected submitting documentation for one of the requirements. Because the data have indicated that the campus PFE policy continues to be an issue, we chose to ask 36 of the 60 LEAs and campuses to provide documentation for that requirement. We asked 12 LEAs for documentation on the Schoolwide Program Campus Comprehensive Needs Assessment and 12 LEAs for documentation on the Schoolwide Program Plan stakeholders. Overall, 49 of the 60 LEAs met the requirement and 11 needed improvement. Broken down by each requirement, the results were as follows. Of the 12 LEAs and campuses selected for the Schoolwide Program Campus Comprehensive Needs Assessment, 11 met the requirement and 1 needed improvement. Of the 12 LEAs and campuses selected for the Schoolwide Program Plan stakeholders, 11 met the requirement and 1 needed improvement. Of the 36 LEAs and campuses selected for the campus-written PFE policy method of distribution and language, 27 met the requirement and 9 needed improvement. LEAs that need improvement will resubmit their documentation in September of 2023 in order to demonstrate their compliance for the 2023-2024 school year. Next, we'd like to take some time to review each of the Title I Part A requirements that were included in the validation, to discuss the documentation that was required, as well as issues that could have resulted in an improvement needed status. For the Schoolwide Campus Comprehensive Needs Assessment, we asked for a description of the campus's comprehensive needs assessment process. Acceptable documentation would be the relevant pages of the Comprehensive Needs Assessment or Campus Improvement Plan that include the description of the campus's comprehensive needs assessment process for the current year. As part of that description, we would expect to see the dates on which the CNA process was conducted, a list of the stakeholders that were involved in the process, a list of the areas that were examined, and a list of the data sources that were analyzed. Issues that may result in an improvement needed status include auditable documentation requested was not submitted. The Comprehensive Needs Assessment Summary did not have all the required components. Or documentation from a prior year was submitted instead of current year documentation. In addition to the description of the process, we requested documentation showing that the process was followed. This additional documentation included the meeting agenda, meeting notes or minutes, and the participant roster or sign-in sheet for one meeting documenting the campus's CNA process. Given the comprehensive nature of the process, it is highly unlikely that it could be accomplished in a single meeting. The LEA should maintain documentation for all its CNA meetings. However, the documentation of only one meeting was requested for this validation. The documentation submitted should provide evidence that the process described in the CNA description was followed. Issues that may result in an improvement needed status include auditable documentation requested was not submitted, documentation submitted does not reference the comprehensive needs assessment process, documentation submitted does not align to the CNA item 1.1 documentation, or documentation from a prior year was submitted instead of current year documentation. Here is an example of a CNA process description that was submitted by an LEA for the campus selected. We can see that there are dates that indicate the process timeline. The data sources the campus uses are listed, and the description includes the areas that were part of the assessment. What we don't see here is a list of the stakeholders. The description mentions this campus's site-based committee, but the membership of that list is not included in the documentation that was submitted. Also, the description that was submitted seems to be created specifically for this validation, rather than being part of the campus's needs assessment document or campus improvement plan. For the school-wide program plan stakeholder requirement, we asked for the relevant pages of the current school year's campus improvement plan that included a list of stakeholders involved in the development of the plan. Acceptable documentation would include a stakeholder listing that includes the individuals by name and the stakeholder group or role that each individual represents. Please note that the Texas Education Code does not allow the parent role to be filled by individuals who are also LEA employees. Title I Part A statute requires that the school-wide program plan be developed with the involvement of parents, other members of the community to be served, teachers, principals, other school leaders, paraprofessionals if the campus has paraprofessionals working in its program, administrators, including administrators of other programs such as Title I Part C or Title I Part D, and tribes and tribal organizations that are present in the community. Other stakeholders, such as specialized instructional support personnel, technical assistance providers, other school staff, and students may also be included if appropriate. Issues that may result in an improvement needed status include auditable documentation requested was not submitted, documentation submitted does not include the individuals by name, documentation submitted does not include the stakeholder roles for each of the individuals listed, or documentation from a prior year was submitted instead of current year documentation. In addition to the list of stakeholders and their roles, we requested documentation showing that the stakeholders were actually involved in the planning process. This additional documentation included the meeting agenda, meeting notes or minutes, and the participant roster or sign-in sheet for one meeting documenting the school-wide planning process. Issues that may result in an improvement needed status include auditable documentation requested was not submitted, documentation submitted does not reference the CIP development process, documentation submitted does not align to the list of stakeholders referenced in CIP Item 1.1 documentation, or the documentation from a prior year was submitted instead of current year documentation. Here is an example of documentation that was submitted for the Schoolwide Program Plan stakeholder requirement. The LEA has marked items 1.2 and 1.4 so that it is clear what part of the documentation the LEA is attempting to provide. The agenda has a title and a date. The LEA seems to have used this copy of the agenda as a sign-in sheet. And I should tell you that the LEA did submit a separate list of stakeholders and roles as part of their documentation for Item 1.1. This particular example is non-compliant for the following reasons. It's labeled District Improvement Team Meeting, and there's no indication of school-wide campus planning associated with this agenda. There are no roles on the section that's marked as the sign-in sheet. There's not a great deal of correlation between the sign-in sheet and the list of team members that was provided in Item 1.1. Only one parent was on the list from Item 1.1, and from the sign-in sheet here, that parent was not in attendance, and there's no way of knowing if any other person on this sign-in sheet is filling that role. That also brings up a question of legibility. That not all of the signatures on this particular sign-in sheet are legible. That's one reason why school districts should ensure that their sign-in sheets have a place for participants to actually print their name in addition to the signature. For the campus written PFE policy requirement, we focus specifically on the description of the method of policy distribution and language. Acceptable documentation would include the relevant pages of the current school year's campus PFE policy that reference the description of how the policy was distributed and in what languages. Issues that may result in an improvement needed status include auditable documentation was not submitted, no reference to a method of distribution was written in the policy, there was no reference to the languages in which the policy was distributed, or documentation submitted does not meet the statutory requirements for the campus written PFE policy. This last bullet was evident when the LEA submitted the campus's entire PFE policy as opposed to only the relevant pages, and there were campus policy requirements that were not addressed. In addition to the description of the policy distribution method, we asked the LEA to submit evidence that the distribution had actually occurred. This could have been accomplished in several ways depending on the distribution method the LEA selected. The LEA may have had more than one distribution method, but we only requested evidence of one. For example, if the campus chose to distribute the PFE policy as part of its student handbook, the LEA could have submitted the relevant pages of the student handbook. If the campus distributed its PFE policy through its website, the LEA could have included a printout of the campus website where the most current policy is posted and provided a link to access that document. If the PFE policy was distributed through direct mail, the LEA could have provided a copy of the letter that accompanied the policy distribution to parents. If the campus distributed its PFE policy by email, the LEA could have provided a copy of the email that includes the email header, which would be the to, from, CC, subject, and attachments line. If the campus used a newspaper publication, the LEA could have included a newspaper clipping or a printout referencing the policy being published in a newspaper. Or if the campus used the student registration process as a means of distribution, the LEA could have provided documentation to that effect. Issues that may result in an improvement needed status include auditable documentation was not submitted, documentation submitted does not align to the method of distribution and language described in PFE Item 1.1, documentation from a prior year was submitted instead of current year documentation, or the web link provided was broken if the campus website is the method of distribution. Here is an example of a student handbook that was submitted as the campus's PFE policy. As you can see, it's a list of things that parents can do to be involved in their child's education. It's a fairly standard list. In fact, it's likely the boilerplate language that appears in at least one student handbook template. We saw this language submitted verbatim by several LEAs. One of the things to note is that it is not a campus PFE policy. It does not address the campus PFE policy requirements. In fact, it's written entirely from the perspective of things parents can do. There's no indication of what the campus will do. It's fine for the language to be included in a student handbook, but this should not be confused with the campus PFE policy. Here is an excerpt from another PFE policy submitted for the 2022-2023 school year. We have included it to show how careful we must be to ensure that all policies and plans are updated at least annually. The last section of this policy refers to Section 1118 of ESEA. The current version of ESEA statute, which is the Every Student Succeeds Act, has the parent and family engagement requirements in Section 1116. Section 1118, which is what is referenced here, is from No Child Left Behind. It's important to know that the fix to this is not simply to change the section number. To fix this policy, the campus and LEA should refer to the campus PFE policy requirements under the Every Student Succeeds Act. Current resources for this are available on the statewide ESSA Title I Part A Parent and Family Engagement Initiative webpage, which is through Region 16's website. In addition to the 3 Title I Part A validations that we've just discussed, we also randomly selected 40 additional LEAs to participate in a validation of the Title I Part A Supplement Not Supplant requirement. Acceptable documentation for this validation was a copy of the LEA's SNS methodology or the LEA's Statement of Exemption. When looking at an SNS methodology, we considered whether the methodology was Title I neutral and whether it described how the LEA distributed its state and local funds to its campuses. When looking at a Statement of Exemption, we considered whether the LEA was eligible for the exemption that it claimed. Issues that may have resulted in an improvement needed status include the methodology did not describe the distribution of state and local funds, the methodology was not Title I neutral, the methodology didn't account for all campuses in the LEA, the exemption that the LEA claimed was not valid, or the documentation submitted was from a prior year instead of current year documentation. If the LEA submitted a methodology, we also asked for relevant summary pages from the general ledger, showing the state and local funds budgeted to each campus. Issues that may have resulted in an improvement needed status include auditable documentation requested was not submitted, campus names and numbers and their corresponding state and local budget totals are not evident, budgeted amounts were not related to the methodology submitted, or documentation from a prior year was submitted instead of current year documentation. Since one of the common issues with the statement of exemption was that the LEA claimed an exemption that it wasn't eligible for, we felt we needed to spend part of this session on explaining how an LEA qualifies for an exemption. An LEA qualifies for a statement of exemption in the following situations. The LEA only has a single campus. In other words, there's only one school in the district. Or all of the campuses in the LEA are Title I campuses. Or the LEA has only one campus per campus category. It has one middle school, one elementary school, one high school. Or each of its campus categories can be excluded. So that's the explanation in a lot of words, but we have a set of visuals that may be a more effective way of explaining these concepts. First, an LEA has only one campus. It's exempt from the methodology requirement. An LEA that has only one campus per campus category with no duplication of grades is exempt from the SNS methodology requirement. An LEA with all Title I Part A campuses is exempt from the SNS methodology requirement. Exempting an entire category of campus can simplify the LEA's methodology, or it may qualify the LEA for a statement of exemption outright. So if an LEA has a campus category that has only one campus, that category could be excluded from the methodology. If the LEA has a campus category that only includes non-Title I campuses, that category could be excluded from the methodology. If the LEA has a campus category that only includes Title I campuses, that category could be excluded from the methodology. If all of the LEA's campus categories can be excluded, then the LEA qualifies for a statement of exemption. If only one or two of the LEA's campus categories can be excluded in this manner, the LEA should state as part of its methodology that those campus categories are excluded, and for what reason, and proceed to describe its methodology for the campus category that cannot be excluded. In that way, it's clear that the LEA has accounted for all of its campuses. Okay, that was a lot of words again. Let's go back to the pictures. In this example, an LEA with only one high school can exclude that campus category from its methodology. If all the middle schools in that LEA are non-Title I campuses, the LEA can exclude its single high school as well as all of its middle schools. In this case, the LEA would be required to have an SNS methodology for the elementary category only. But let's change this example a bit. Let's suppose that all of the elementary schools in the LEA are Title I campuses. In this case, all the campuses are excluded, and the LEA does qualify for a statement of exemption. Now you're ready for your pop quiz. If the LEA consists of one PK through 8 campus and one 9 through 12 campus. Is this LEA exempt or not exempt from the methodology requirement? Because this LEA has a single campus per campus category and no duplication of grades, this LEA would be exempt. Okay, here the LEA has a PK through 5 campus, a K through 5 campus, 2 6 through 8 campuses, and one 9 through 12 campus. Is it exempt or not exempt? Yeah, sorry, this is a trick question. You don't actually have enough information to make that determination. Any guesses on what else you need to know? You need to know which campuses are Title I Part A campuses. So let's fix that. If I tell you that the PK through 5 campus is the only Title I Part A campus of this LEA, now can you tell me whether the LEA is exempt or not exempt? The single high school can be excluded because there's only one campus in that category. The middle schools can be excluded because they're all not Title I. There's a mix of Title I and non-Title I elementary schools. So what does that mean? So in this case, the LEA would not be exempt. The LEA needs an S&S methodology for its elementary schools. So if we change the example so that there is no longer a mix of elementary schools, let's say they're both Title I. The 9 through 12 campus can be excluded because there's only one. The middle schools can be excluded because they're all not Title I. And all of the elementary schools can be excluded because they are all Title I. So in this example, each of the categories can be excluded, so the LEA would be eligible to have a statement of exemption from the S&S methodology. The Title I Part A program staff at the Regional Education Service Centers have received training on the Title I Part A supplement not supplant methodology requirement, and they are available as a resource to assist with questions you may have. They're a great place to start if you want to get into specifics about your particular campus configuration. If you talk with them and you still want to run something by me, you're welcome to send me an email. We can set up some time to talk about it. My email address at the Texas Education Agency is vivian.smurl@tea.texas.gov. You're welcome to send questions there or to the division's email address at essasupport@tea.texas.gov. We're always looking for questions to add to our FAQ documents.